Hey, this is Aaron Carnes. We started this podcast in 2021 to promote my book, In Defense of Ska. Since then, the podcast has grown into its own thing. I've been working on an expanded second edition. I interviewed new people, edited every chapter, and there's a new final chapter, 30,000 new words. The expanded second edition of In Defense of Ska will be released on October 29th, 2024. Can you do something for me? Pre-order it right now at clashbooks.com under the Books tab. The more copies it sells in advance, the more it'll get people to support ska music. Thanks.
The biggest winner in the big game could be you, thanks to BetMGM. The king of sportsbooks is offering new customers a chance to score $158 in bonus bets instantly. That's right, instantly. Just download the BetMGM app and sign up using bonus code Vegas58. Then place a $5 moneyline wager on the big game. You'll receive $158 in bonus bets instantly, regardless of your wager's outcome. Don't miss your opportunity to cross the goal line on the money line as pro football's top teams clash for the championship. Can't be in Vegas for the big game? Then bring the big game excitement to you with BetMGM. BetMGM and GameSense reminds you to play responsibly. See BetMGM.com for terms. 21 plus only. Virginia only. New customer offer. Subject to eligibility requirements. Rewards are non-withdrawable bonus bets that expire in 7 days. Please gamble responsibly. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. That's 1-800-GAMBLER. Promotional offer not available in Washington, D.C.
Consequence Podcast Network. Welcome to In Defense of Ska. We aim to push back on the mainstream's negative perception of the music. Ska deserves the respect genres like punk, hip-hop, and hardcore find among their listeners. And we also like to dive into ska history. Our host is renowned music journalist and author of the book In Defense of Ska, Aaron Carnes.
Ska proliferated in Jamaica in the late 50s and early 60s, but soon evolved into rocksteady and then reggae. But there was a ska revival in England in the late 70s. This time, the music was a deliberate blending of Jamaican music and the punk and post-punk styles that were popular in the UK. These bands, The Specials, The Selector, Madness, The Beat, Body Snatchers, and Bad Manners reinvented ska and influenced how it would be played across the world going forward. We now refer to this slice of history as two-tone ska, though two-tone refers to the record label started by Jerry Dammers, keyboardist of The Specials. Two-tone ska was overtly political, leftist, anti-racist, and had mixed-race bands. They made a whole generation of kids dance their asses off and think about politics in a new way. Two-tone ska was top 40 music in the UK. Everywhere else, it was a slow burn that would grow into huge ska scenes as the years progressed. To get a full picture of two-tone ska, we speak to Daniel Rachel, author of the definitive two-tone oral history, Too Much, Too Young, which releases in the US on March 5th, 2024. And now, joining me is my co-host, veteran ska musician Adam Davis of Omnigon and Link 80.
It feels like, for years, a lot of this history went unrecorded, and now kind of like your book and a lot of these other books that have been coming out are filling in the gaps.
Yeah, oddly enough, there hasn't been a definitive two-tone oral history yet. The two-tone has been documented in various BBC programs or in other books, but it's always a piece of a larger picture. Like there was Reggae Britannica, which kind of discussed the reggae influences of England, and Reggae Punk Britannica. But this book, and I'm really happy for it, is strictly about two-tone ska.
Yeah. And I mean, the genre is super important. It doesn't really get the respect it deserves. There's other, genres from that time that maybe weren't as succinctly on the right side of history as two-tone ska.
Yeah, I mean, like, to be frank, I mean, some of these like hipster punk and post-punk bands, which I like, they kind of thought it was cool to play with Nazi imagery and fascism. It doesn't look good, looking back, but I mean, you look at two-tone ska, these bands were talking about fighting racism. They were kicking Nazis out of their shows. I mean, they weren't messing around with that stuff at all.
Yeah. Two-tone ska in late 70s England is really a moment in pop history unlike any other.
So first off, I just want to kind of like explain a little bit who you are. You've written, how many books have you written at this point?
I've written 5 of my own and a further 5 that I've co-written.
Which do you prefer?
uh, well, hmm. Well, I've got a big ego, so I just want my name on the front cover of every book.
Sure, that's understandable.
But subject matter wise, that's what drives me to want to be involved in books. So as long as I don't think I do have a well, I do have a preference. Yeah, I want it to be mine and mine only.
Yeah, I've read two aside from your new book. I've read two other books. I've read Walls Come Tumbling Down, which is an excellent book,
Thank you.
and Don't Look Back in Anger, which is also great.
I'm really proud of those two books. I really am.
What I like about both of them is that they're both very expansive in their views of this sort of time period, this piece of culture, maybe things people are thinking of in purely musical pieces of history, but you really go way beyond the music, and you they have so much context politically and culturally. For Walls Come Tumbling Down is like, for people listening, is it kind of goes from Rock Against Racism to um what's the sorry, it goes Rock Against Racism, Two Tone, and then
Red Wedge, which was a kind of a socialist movement in the mid '80s.
so it really kind of talks about the politics of British music from these specific time periods. And then Don't Look Back in Anger on its surface is about Britpop, but it's really about everything around that too, culturally. And which, just a sidebar, because this conversation is going to be about your new book. But one of the things that really I didn't really understand about that time period and that music, it was that there was a I guess you would say, like in the 80s and in the UK, there was sort of a political correct sort of time period, and it was being reacted against in the 90s. Was it? Would you say that's kind of how you would put it?
Well, it's curious because I had no intention of writing a book that was just about Britpop. To my mind, the book has always and is about the phenomena of Cool Britannia.
Yeah, Cool Britannia, which I didn't really fully understand. I didn't really understand the bigger picture of what Britpop was part of.
Yeah, exactly. So to my mind, Cool Britannia covers a range of culture, which is art, literally artists, Tracy Emin, Damien Hirst, and then film, literature, sport, football, the politics of Tony Blair and John Major. And Britpop's just one strand within that story.
Yeah, yeah,
But in many ways, the progression of British culture in the 1980s, which was proactively trying to carry forward ideas of gay rights and uh, an equitous status for men and women, just to name two things, took a kind of a smack in the face in the 90s, where lad culture threw back seemingly many years of the progression of what was looking good for women, and many aspects of the 90s just excluded people of color. It was very, very white, Cool Britannia. And so on a surface level, yes, I think you're right to say that the 90s was had a great spirit and euphoria and positivity that the 80s didn't have, but it socially, culturally, and perhaps politically took a step backwards.
yeah. See, the reason that was so interesting to me is because the 80s in the US would definitely not be characterized as a progressive time period. It was very regressive here. Um, with Reagan, and like all of our popular movies were very, very much pushed a conservative idea about who was cool, who was uncool, what was, you know, the jokes about gay people in 80s movies were horrendous, just to start there, and sexist. So, if anything, the 90s felt like a push forward progressively for us.
No, what I guess what I'm saying in the 80s is that those cultural ways of thinking that you're talking about were there within progressive, forward-thinking artists, but it
Mm.
wasn't the wider mainstream I mean, we had we had Reagan's puppet, didn't we, Mrs. Thatcher here,
Sure.
and
Yeah.
and her Conservative government, and you know, in point of fact, the majority of Britons probably would say they benefited under Thatcherism. But if you were part of those that didn't, then you truly suffered. And you know, employment was so desperately high, and you know, kind of the standard of living and the regressive acts and Clause 28, which made it illegal to teach homosexuality as it was labelled then in schools. You know, there's so many repressive laws. Then we weren't a country going forward in many respects. But yeah, I mean, it's such a big debate, isn't it? We'll go off on a whole different tangent if we
Yeah.
follow it. So,
Anyways, I just want to say that I found that book's really, both those books are very interesting.
thank you.
A lot to think about. Yeah. And also, before we get into Too Much Too Young, you also are a musician. You have a history playing in a band, Rachel's Basement in the '90s. Highlight that as well.
Oh, thank you. I didn't do very much. I actually had more success releasing a couple of solo albums in the 2000s, but it was nowhere near as good or half as much fun as being in the band.
Yeah. I watched a little clip of you on, I don't know what program
Oh
it was,
yeah,
like a music program.
yeah.
Yes, where you are being interviewed, and you tell a story about how you went to Paris to play some solo shows, and you're playing Lou Reed, and this guy, French guy, jumps on stage and starts playing with you, and now he's in the band.
Yeah, yeah, French Mach, and we kind of cement our friendship over Lou Reed. I remember that. Yeah, so that was a nice little story just to guide us along.
There's a few like weird details that popped out at me in reading Too Much Too Young. Just want to talk about those first, and then we'll kind of get more into the history, which I think the history is very interesting, especially for anyone our audience, which is largely a U.S. audience. I think understanding the context of two tone is something that's it's challenging. You know, I think in a way where people from the UK understand a lot of these references and a lot of what and why things happened. But so first detail that popped out to me, uh, John Lennon apparently was a fan of the Selector and specifically the song "Too Much Pressure."
Isn't that a great little story that when he was recording in 1980 and he was after a certain sound and he got his valet to go out and get the Selector record. Isn't that brilliant? I just, and obviously being a fan
Yeah,
of the Beatles, it was just an excuse to get a little Beatles reference in there. But it doesn't half. I just thought, you know, the Selector don't know that as a band, then they're going to be so thrilled to read it because who doesn't want John Lennon to be into their band?
Sure.
Yeah, no, that's
Yeah.
just a fun little thing, really. Pumping out too much pressure from the Dakota. Yeah, open those windows and open it out onto the park. Brilliant.
the other thing you mentioned is also kind of an aside too, but you mentioned that there was a show in Britain called the Black and White Minstrel Show
Yeah,
that went from 1958 to 1978,
yeah,
and this like completely surprised me that there would be minstrel stuff on TV up till 78.
yeah. Well, I mean, you had minstrels in the States, didn't you? And you know, basically white people, black painting a black
Oh
face.
yeah, I mean I think we
Yeah,
invented it. So, but I think it wasn't happening in 1978. You
no,
know, that's what
it's
I think the thing
shocking.
that shocked me about it. Yeah.
Well, British television in the 1970s, programs like that, and a program called Mind Your Language, which is set in non Brits in a school trying to learn the language to speak English. And there was Sid James, who people may know from the Carry On films, was in sitcoms, and Alf Garnett. All these people were openly racist on British television, using language that is not acceptable today. It was kind of shocking then, using a kind of a language that would be familiar to a Ku Klux Klan meeting. and that permeated television. And if it was on mainstream television at prime time television slots, prime time, dinner slots, then it was. You can imagine what that was like in the playground, on the streets, in the pub. I mean, racism was endemic in many ways in Britain post-war, and that is feeds into a, a strong reason and desire for Jerry Dammers to create Two Tone.
Let's get into that larger context. One of those is the National Front. So, can you explain what the National Front is, who Enoch Powell was, and because it's very important to understand Rock Against Racism and Two Tone.
Yeah. So, the National Front were a right wing organization that advocated the policies of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party, that had members that dressed up in Nazi regalia and questioned the numbers that were exterminated in the death camps in Poland. And they formed in 1967, and then incrementally all the way through to 1979, um, gained electoral support. So they were winning council seats across the country, and they were sometimes beating the major political parties in elections into third place, and come the next general election in the UK, which would be May 1979, the election that Margaret Thatcher wins. um, they were they intended to put a candidate in every single constituency across Britain, so I think 630 at that point, which therefore meant that they could have party political broadcast on British television. They were marching the streets in with huge numbers, and advocating for the repatriation of anybody that wasn't born white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, and it was Nazism, and but they were becoming a force to be reckoned with. Margaret Thatcher spoke and used rhetoric that was of the National Front in a blatant attempt to woo their support to the Conservatives. Now, a member of the Conservative government in 1968 was the minister Enoch Powell, and he made a speech which has infamously become known as the Rivers of Blood, where he predicted that in 20 years' time that the black man would have the whip hand over the white man in this country, and he again wanted a repatriation of all the people that, ironically, he and his government had invited from the Caribbean islands in the late 40s and early 50s to come to Britain as British citizens to help revive the economy and work in areas like transport on the buses. So that was an incendiary speech, racist ultimately, and he was discredited in later years. And so, yeah, the backdrop of Two Tone is marches on the streets of neo-Nazis, right-wing fascists, gaining political support and wooing a young youth generation to the ideology of fascism.
Are you able to break down also sort of so skinheads in the '60s is a movement, or is a fashion, maybe you could say, subculture of working class white kids who are not really driven by an ideology, but just a love of this music and fashion. But some of them become co-opted by this National Front sort of movement.
Yeah, I mean, skinheads come. They begin to really become a recognizable cult in around 1969, particularly as ska evolves to rocksteady, becomes reggae, and
Mhm.
there was a racist element from when I speak to people I remember speaking to Dave Ruffy from the Ruts and Jerry Dammers, and there were racist elements where these skinheads would particularly go out and in the vernacular, an offensive vernacular of the time, would go paki bashing, which is to find people of Indian origin, Pakistani origin, and well, in some cases, murder. And that isn't to say that all skinheads were like that, and they're absolutely can't be singly defined as racist. There were racist elements in the same way as I know these movements get defined as working class in the same way as Two Tone does, but I've never been aware of when you go into a gig or go out on a going to lynch people or whatever, that there's somebody with a board who's stopped you and said, "Oh, excuse me, are you working class? Are you middle class? Are you upper class?" So these kind of terms get bandied around, and there's no proof for it. But I think people just like to think that everybody's working class to make it sound cool. But I mean, as we discover in Two Tone and the musicians of Two Tone, they're certainly not all working class by no means. I mean, Jerry is middle class for a start, as is many of the musicians. So that notion needs to be dispelled immediately.
I guess working class, even if it doesn't justify it, it like semi justifies it in a way. It's like, well, they're working class. They're a little bit disenfranchised too, so you can kind of understand. Like it kind of has that little bit of subtext to it.
Well, maybe, but that because you're working class doesn't mean that you're disenfranchised anyway. I mean, the working class vote as much as anybody votes of any class. That doesn't make you
Yeah.
disenfranchised, and the working class vote in the millions. So, no, I'm not sure if I accept that.
I'm just stating it not as a reality, but as a perception, because we have that same perception in the U.S. This idea that, oh, white working class people, like it's almost like because they're quote unquote working class, and again, like you said, not actually proven, that it almost justifies their anger. I don't feel it justifies their anger at all. I'm just saying I think that
Yeah.
there's that sort of perception in media that is like,
It's brilliant nowadays because political vernacular here, but I don't know if it's in the States, but they don't say working class anymore. They say normal people, normal or
God,
hardworking
yeah.
people. And whether it's the leader of the opposition or the prime minister, hardworking Britons want this, or normal people don't want this. They mean working class, but nobody will say it anymore. But going back to skinheads, I mean, skinheads had a revival in the late 70s, and the skinhead movement, as I'm sure your listeners know and is becomes a vital component of the Two Tone audience for sure.
And so stuff that I've read in this book and also Walls Come Tumbling Down, there are multiple quotes from Jerry Dammers where he talks about seeing the revival coming,
Yeah.
kind of nervous about it because of this association with these right wing elements and wanting to deliberately steer it into a better direction.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing that Jerry. This is one person that when the Specials Coventry Automatics tour with the Clash in 1978, and they play at certain gigs, and there's what Jerry calls the Sham Army, which is skinhead followers of the group Sham 69, and elements of those audiences and elements of the band The Damned, who the Specials play with, have people who Sieg Heil the band and fight, and there's a lot of violence coming from the football terraces into gigs because there's a clampdown on football violence here, which pushes kids to take out these frustrations at gigs. And Jerry sees all this, and he thinks there's a moment where this youth generation, this young generation that are impressionable, of an impressionable age, as we all are in our late teens and early 20s, and he wants to create something positive that will take them forward with music and see multiculturalism and the bringing together of black and white as something that would be good for society, and that can be done with dancing and socially aware lyrics. And out of that simple kind of idealistic utopian idea, he makes it happen. It's extraordinary. It's absolutely extraordinary.
Yeah. And so when you're talking about the sham army, there's a specific story in your book where they, isn't it that they beat up the singer of the band Suicide, right?
Yeah, Suicide are on tour on that Clash tour with the Specials, and I think this they get stuff chucked at them, and Suicide pack up their bags and come back to the States, don't they? But if you've heard Suicide records, there was no way that was going to work in front of a Clash audience, was it? Let alone this band of upstarts from Coventry who are playing half of a reggae song, and then it cuts and goes to a punk song, then it cuts and goes back to a reggae song. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah.
So, I mean, people say they were great, but people say, really, were they great, or are you saying they were great because you know what the Specials become? Because when you listen to the demo tapes of late '78, early '79 of the Coventry Automatics, they're not very good. And unless there was something
Yeah.
sensationally different live, then I can't really believe. I don't know. I mean, who's to say? And these people saw it and said it was brilliant. So there you are.
Also, along the context of what was happening pre Rock Against Racism, pre Two Tone, is the Eric Clapton's infamous drunken rants of in support of Enoch Powell and in support of, like you said, repatriating anyone who's not white and who was an immigrant.
Yeah, I mean, he called them out at the Birmingham Odeon in 1976. Are there any foreigners in the audience? He asked. And then when everybody raised their hands, he identified them with abusive language and said, "You need to go back home to your own country." And I spoke to Dave Wakeling, of the lead singer of the Beat, and he's down the front. He can't believe it. Birmingham. I'm from Birmingham, and Birmingham is accepting and is very got a cross section of all hues and colours and races. And for Clapton to come and do that in Birmingham was incredible. This is the man that had a #1 hit in America and the UK with "I Shot the Sheriff." But yeah, so he makes this outburst over the course of the evening, and then has never, to this day, satisfactorily apologised. And as a result of Clapton and what David Bowie was banging on at the time about that, Hitler was the first rock and roll superstar and the kind of person that Britain needs as a leader today. And Rod
Mm-hmm.
Stewart kind of saying about, the immigrants who go back home. Rock Against Racism was born, and its political statement was to put a reggae band and a punk band on a stage together. And then they jammed as musicians at the end of the evening. And Jerry went to some of these gigs in Coventry, and he had the bright idea of putting actually the black and white members together in one band. So he intentionally recruited the best musicians he could find in Coventry that were both black and white to make his own political statement. And although now today that may sound like, well, so what, black and white, because we're so familiar with it, in 1978, 77, 79, that's an incredibly daring and radical thing to do. He's not the first, because there are examples, but hardly any, and it wasn't done as a political statement.
Yeah, exactly. So we talked a little bit about like late '60s reggae and skinheads. How popular or well known was this music leading into Two Tone? I mean, when 1979, when the Specials released Gangsters and it becomes a hit, what is the understanding of ska and reggae and rocksteady to the general public?
That's a good question. I mean, I think we're a bit more advanced in the States because as I write in the book, there was the Broadway musical in 1980 called Reggae, which completely flopped. And there's that brilliant appearance of John Lennon on the Mike Douglas show where he's asked what he's into, and he says reggae. And Mike Douglas says, "What's that?" And he has to explain this word reggae and what the kind of music
Yeah.
is. But so here, uh, when that turn of reggae that we kind of mentioned, 69, 70, 71, there were hits, British hits, big hits, #1 hits. I mean, it had really be the great record is Millie Small, "My Boy Lollipop," which is a smash hit in 1964 on Fontana, an offshoot of what Chris Blackwell was doing at Ireland. And then we have Dave and Ansel Collins and Desmond Dekker, and so there is a swathe of hits, 69, 70, but I think it's kind of seen as novelty. And when these bands appear on Top of the Pops, some of them dress in tribal outfits. I'm just thinking of, I think it's Dave and Ansel when they do Double Barrel, a dress like that. I mean, it's Return to Django. But so there is a precedent. And then Ken Booth, Everything I Own, has a number one hit, I think, in Britain in 74. There's bits and pieces of it. But anyway, I think what's more significant is it's really important to remember and recognize that two-tone is a hybrid of genres that doesn't have any precedent in any music in any country, because two-tone is not ska. Two-tone is everything, is ska plus everything that happens between 64, say, and 1979, which is rock, disco, and punk. And without those elements in two-tone, you don't have two-tone. So Horace Panter of the Specials plays disco bass lines. Think of Nightclub, the octaves, semitone octave rises up and down. He does pure disco, same as Charlie Anthony and Selector doing a similar kind of thing. Punk is Roddy Byers' guitar in the Specials. It's the delivery and the attitude of Terry Hall. Terry Hall does not sound like Desmond Dekker or Prince Buster, and so it goes on. You can go across the band. Pauline Black is influenced by folk music. Her big influences are people like Joan Armatrading and Bert Jansch. And all of the band, Madness, is influences Motown. Not solely Motown, but it's an important influence. And Woody in Badness rarely, if ever, played an offbeat. He always plays on beat, which is certainly not Jamaican and definitely not ska, even though they're doing Prince Buster songs. So yeah, two-tone is an incredibly original hybrid and unique to itself.
In Defense of Ska will return in a moment.
Hey, welcome to Kyle Meredith with Consequence. This is where we check out some of the cool new things happening in the Consequence Podcast Network. I'm Kyle Meredith. Today, I get to talk with Adam Unz to discuss the latest season of The Opus.
Hi.
Well, first off, Adam, congratulations on the new season.
Thanks, Kyle.
So, which album is in the spotlight this season?
As always, it's presented by the Consequence Podcast Network and Sony Legacy Recordings. It's a music history series, and it's coming back to celebrate the 30th anniversary of Alice in Chains' sophomore album, Dirt.
What a classic album. I completely remember hearing it, those first few listens back when it came out. 92, I probably picked it up in 93 and 94. It was just dark and heavy and so melodically beautiful at the same time.
I know. Dirt was truly a genre-bending collection that defined an era. So we're going to help our listeners to explore the context of what was happening back then and also hear how it still inspires artists and fans today.
Sounds great. And you can listen to it at consequence.net or, of course, wherever you get podcasts. It's great talking with you, Adam. Thanks for stopping by.
Thanks, Kyle.
That was something I wanted to talk about next, was this idea about how it was, not only was it a unique hybrid, but it was kind of had like foresight and thought of that way. Like nobody was like, let's revive ska. It was like, let's modernize, let's take influences here, let's create a new thing. Like everyone, particularly Jerry Dammers, create something new. It was never about let's create something old.
Yeah, kind of yes and no. I mean, because the big, as Jerry says in Too Much Too Young, the big revelation is the capital letters song, Smoking My Ganja, which I find it difficult to hear what Jerry hears in that, but he hears ska, and he realizes that if he uses ska instead of reggae with the nascent specials, he will achieve what he wants to achieve, and simply because the tempo of rock music and ska music is the same. It's on the 4/4, and that becomes hugely important for Roddy in the specials. When at first he thinks he has to rewrite all his guitar lines because he's got to try and work out how you play in an offbeat manner. But then he realizes because the tempo is the same, you can play the same rock and roll kind of Johnny Thunder style guitar parts, and it will work. And John Bradbury, is just incredible behind the drum kit in his ability to switch between rock and Jamaican offbeat. And that's not no easy thing for a drummer to do. And I think he's the smoothest of all the bands and the players to do that. But I think so. So Jerry definitely is trying to lean on the past, and then what he calls musical quotations. So Gangsters and Too Much Too Young exist already as special songs, and then he adds the elements from the original songs, and the demos exist where those elements aren't there. So literally, here's a musical quotation changing the song. So they are taken from the past, but how much of that is a proactive conversation amongst all the members of the band? I think my overriding sense would be, talking to all the musicians, it's not, Neil Davis naturally plays blues and he loves reggae, and it just becomes over the years playing with the various different bands in Coventry, his style emerges. So when he forms a selector, he plays that style, and Compton, as the other guitarist, comes from he's Ghanaian. So Compton's coming in with a very different style, but I think they're kind of natural styles in a way. And Horace, he learnt reggae bass, and he was being taught how to do it by members of the selection, and the specials. But he was trying to bring in, all, he likes the average white band, and he's trying to fuse these different kind of influences. So I think it's a bit of both, I think, to what you're suggesting. Some of it's very conscious, some of it's just natural, as is the case with how musicians and bands work, I'd say.
Yeah. From a historical point of view, you could say like, okay, so punk explodes in England and then two-tone, but I mean, it's a little more complicated than that. And there's also the element of reggae being something that's pretty close to and around punk as well. So the fact that two-tone comes out after as a punked up version of ska and reggae does sort of make sense from an evolutionary point of view.
Well, I completely forgot when you just said about the fusion of punk and reggae. Of course, from '76 onwards, reggae really becomes a thing, mainly because of Bob Marley. He's a superstar, isn't he, by '79? So, a lot of, but who's buying Bob Marley records? I don't know. How mainstream he was to a British audience at that point. But that fusion's there, isn't it? And it's, you hear it in the Clash, the Police.
The Members is another one.
Yeah, they weren't a big band, but there's lots,
Yeah.
the Ruts, lots of bands on the periphery. But I think probably the Police are the biggest band, aren't they? That really cross over and have massive audience doing this kind of fusion music.
They're one of the few bands that you're talking about too that actually has a huge audience in the US as well.
Yes. And then the Beat Go and tour with the Police, and the Specials do. I'm not sure if Madness do. Perhaps they do. They benefit, don't they, all the way through their careers, supporting the Police. Even the final gig the Specials ever play in Boston, I think in '81, is supporting the Police.
So okay, the earlier version of the Specials. I don't know exactly when they changed the name.
'78, apparently, first night of the Clash tour at Aylesbury. That's what apparently is the case.
But they also took a break, didn't they, for like 6 months to sort of retool this vision of playing ska rather than reggae and punk.
The Bernie Rhodes years, yeah. Bernie Rhodes knows, don't argue. Yeah. He takes them on and says, "Stop playing live. You're not ready." Tells Jerry, "Don't don't dress how you want to. Dress how the audience are. Copy the audience." And then sends them off to Paris. And they arrive just as the Damned have smashed up all this their hotel, and the specials cop it. And, and then suddenly guns appear, guitars are confiscated. They come back to England and they're rehearsing in the Clash's room, rehearsals. And Jerry upturns Joe Strummer's guitar, gets a piece of paper out and a pen, and writes "Gangsters" on the back of Joe Strummer's guitar.
Damn.
I love that too because the specials, all the two-tone bands, it appears as a movement because part of what you're saying is like they all had a good look. They all looked a little different, but they all made sense together.
Yeah.
Like there was a fashion associated with the music, there was an ideology associated with the music, there was certain styles of music. So it really had a strong appearance when these bands all started having singles on the radio and started touring stuff. And again, just like the music, it's like they took pieces of old culture and they recontextualized them a bit. The rude boy thing is an interesting one. Rude boy used to mean something different in Jamaica. It was more, I'm not sure exactly how you would describe it, but it wasn't a guy who liked ska. It was, but that's kind of what it became through two tone.
Well, I mean, they were rude boys in Jamaica, carried guns and were violent, looked great, looked cool, had a look, and then you get that kind of transition between ska and rocksteady, where you do get the rude boy kind of records and the songs about the rude boys going to jail and 100 years sentences and whatever else. And Jerry nonchalantly said in an interview in the British papers in early '79, "We need a cult of our own." You know, the Pistols, then the Clash had the punks, and Paul Weller's got the mods. We need something, and he says, "Oh, I don't know, something like Rude Boys or something," knowing full well but he'd already imagined this and he got this dream that he could turn everybody into all these kids on the street into Rudies. And again, it happens. But right, I've seen this thing that Jerry had a cigarette packet, and he opened it up, and on the blank side, on the inside, he wrote down what he thought a rude boy was in blue pen, and he makes this list of the records that rude boys would listen to and the clothes they would wear, and it's a fusion of skinhead and mod of the '60s, and then they introduced this concept to the British public, and it sweeps the nation, and it's quite amazing. And then, then they do a cover of Dandy's "A Message to You, Rudy," and I think this is the thing I've never quite understood, and I definitely misunderstood it 100% at the time. But as you're saying, the Rude Boys were ragamuffins in the to use Neville Staples' terminology in the mid '60s, gun carriers. These were violent people.
Yeah.
So here's the special saying, "You're all rudies, but don't be violent. Here's a message to you." So they say, "Be a Rudy, but don't be a Rudy." And then the brilliant side to that is, I think, unless you can prove me wrong, Pauline Black invents the rude girl.
That's my understanding as well.
Isn't that brilliant?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Because it's not Rhoda. Because Rhoda is a mod, and she's dressing in '60s gear, and and Pauline, Belinda Magnus, who doesn't know who she is, she's been raised by a white family in Essex, joins the band, and when she doesn't want to get caught out by the government for claiming dole and being for working and being out on the road and whatever else, needs a new identity, and together with the band come up with Pauline Black. She literally says, I found my new identity. I am Black and I am Pauline. And so she dons the clothes primarily of what the specials were wearing and becomes the first rude girl. Amazing. And everybody got
It is,
up.
yeah.
Yeah, and for girls, young women, what a role model. I mean, when I did when I helped to reissue the Selector Too Much Pressure album, and I got to hear all these tapes of the Specials playing live in '79 and '80. Some of them from the record label, some from Neil Davis's collection, and I heard sound checks and gigs from all over the place. Every single instance where the voice is needed, Pauline gives it everything. She's such a powerful singer, such dedication, perfect tuning each time, great attitude. The only sadness to me is we're in Too Much Pressure. For a brief period, she used to sing the backing vocal, too much pressure for the rude boy, too much pressure for the rude boy. And I really wish they'd kept that line, or I could have used a version with that just so it exists for fans, because it's so cool.
Yeah. Okay, so the Specials release Gangster, and then on the other side is
Gangsters.
yeah, Gangster. B-side is the Selector Kingston Affair, but it's not really the Selector we know today. It's Neil Davis and John Bradbury, Specials drummer. I can't remember if anyone else is on that recording.
Somebody plays trombone, Barry from the Sweet Shop.
Okay.
That's true.
So they self-released this record at this point, right? And they got some money, some funding from some shady character named Jimbo.
Yeah, be careful. Don't say his full name. That had to come out the book. Roddy said that they went to get the money, and they had to open the glove compartment, and there was a gun in there. It's like him and Terry were there, and they were just really scared. And I said to Roddy, what kind of a guy is this Jimbo? And he said, well, put it this way: rumor around Coventry was that he'd force somebody to dig a shallow grave. Oh Christ! What was going to happen to him? And he said, I can't tell you too much because this guy's still around. He was of dual heritage, mixed heritage, and he was a former boxer, and he put up £2,000. And thank God that they sold enough records, because they did pay him back. But he's virtually impossible to find any trace of online. And I began to investigate, and then I think Roddy and Jerry was subtly warning me off.
You're getting close. Stay away.
Don't follow the money, Daniel. That's Jerry. Jerry's advice.
This was an interesting detail too about the recording of Gangsters. Terry Hall recorded an angry vocal take and a board take, and combined them. That's cool.
Yeah, Horace says that. He said it's a Jim Morrison idea, and they're big Doors fans, aren't they? I mean, you hear that in Terry Hall's music throughout all his career. There's always a Doors influence in the music he makes, and I really like that that you hear that. And and the great one is right at the end of Two Tones Life on the Higsons, tear the whole thing down. There's a massive thunderclap, and Jerry recorded that from outside his window of his flat, because it was on Riders on the what's the title? Riders on the Storm, the Doors song, and he'd always wanted it on a record. So there it is on the Higsons. But yeah, I mean, I think Terry's voice is really interesting, because if you think of how he sings on the Too Much Too Young EP, it's sensational, and he's just almost completed 50 dates of the Two Tone tour, a massive, extensive tour. If you then listen to the voice on the Specials album, it's a lot thinner. And then if you go back and listen to, say, the Specials at the Moonlight, or any bootlegs from that period, it's really desperately he's trying to find himself. So his development as a lead singer in a just a matter of months, I think, is quite extraordinary. And then as you get into 1980, how he performs on Rat Race and more Specials, I mean, he's so confident by that point as a vocalist. It's brilliant. Yeah, I mean, great singer, isn't he?
Oh, he's one of the best singers from that era. And I, go into Fun Boy 3, go into his solo stuff in the 90s. He's an awesome singer.
Yeah. No, I can. The best album that I think Terry Hall does after Fun Boy 3 and Colourfield, probably after Fun Boy 3, is the Mushtaq album. I think is that 99, 2000. That to me, if anybody ever said, what would the specials have sounded like 20 years later? I suspect it would have been that Mushtaq album, The Hour of Two Lights with Terry Ray.
We'll be right back after this.
Hey, welcome to Kyle Meredith with Consequence. This is where we check out some of the cool new things happening in the Consequence Podcast Network. I'm Kyle Meredith. Today, I get to talk with Adam Unz to discuss the latest season of The Opus.
Hi.
Well, first off, Adam, congratulations on the new season.
Thanks, Kyle.
So, which album is in the spotlight this season?
As always, it's presented by the Consequence Podcast Network and Sony Legacy Recordings. It's a music history series, and it's coming back to celebrate the 30th anniversary of Alice in Chains' sophomore album, Dirt.
What a classic album. I completely remember hearing it, those first few listens back when it came out, 92. I probably picked it up in 93 and 94. It was just dark and heavy and so melodically beautiful at the same time.
I know. Dirt was truly a genre-bending collection that defined an era. So we're going to help our listeners to explore the context of what was happening back then and also hear how it still inspires artists and fans today.
Sounds great. And you can listen to it at consequence.net or, of course, wherever you get podcasts. It's great talking with you, Adam. Thanks for stopping by.
Thanks, Kyle.
So I want to talk about the Two-Tone as a label, the stuff that you talk about and the deal they got is all kind of so strange to me. I want to kind of get some insight into that. Like Gangsters does well. And so that gives them leverage to talk to record labels and kind of iron out a deal. And so they get a deal with Chrysalis, but their deal is they want their own label and they want full control of it. How would you describe it? Because it seems like they got a deal that was kind of really good and kind of unprecedented.
It's nuts because they've got Mick Jagger coming down to see them saying, come and sign to Rolling Stones Records. They've got Richard Branson saying, whatever you get, I'll double and put money in the back pocket of the manager. They've got 4 or 5 labels all offering them deals. And and again, I went and spoke to Chrysalis Records, the main player. There's 2 main players there, Roy Eldridge and Doug Darcy. And I spoke to both of them for Too Much Too Young. And they were infatuated with what they saw. And the specials, like Roy. And Roy gets it. But basically what Jerry has charged Rick Rogers to do, Rick being pretty much the de facto manager, he has to sign the specials to a record deal. But if they sign the specials, the label have to agree to a thing called Two-Tone, and this thing called Two-Tone is allowed to put out up to 10 records a year by any band. So the record labels go, who are these other bands? Jerry says, no idea, never. I don't know what but they're going to be great. Trust me. Okay. And then tell me more. Okay. So when they come and make a record for us, they can do one song and then they don't really have a contract. They can just go off and do whatever they want. So Madness do one song and leave as Jerry wants it to go and do Stiff. And then the Beat do a single, off they go and do Go Feed with Arista. And it's just nuts. But what I did discover when I wrote the book is that I compared the advance of bands like The Clash and the Sex Pistols compared to the Specials advance. And what it seems to me is I think the Specials signed for £20,000 pounds, and they really could have been getting in excess of £100,000, which would have made more sense for a deal of 1979 with a band with a buzz around it to the extent the Specials had. And it seems that the compromise is in taking the Two-Tone label on. Now that's me not hypothesizing, this conjecture. I don't know that for certain, but that's how it suggested itself to me. But either way, Jerry gets what he wants. And the most important aspect of that deal is Jerry has total autonomy. He will decide, as I've said, all the bands. He will decide who signed to Two Tone. He will decide what the songs are they put out. He will decide the artwork, and he will present pretty much everything as a fait accompli to Chrysalis. And Chrysalis go, "Yep, sign here," and so they do. And I think that speaks volumes about Jerry's dedication to an idea, and a passion for making a British Motown, a label that has an identifiable sound, and if not quite the Henry Ford production line, and that idea of we'll get out, churn out singles, and they do, and they're big hits, and they sell 250,000, 500,000 number ones. It's incredible that it all works.
The deal, I think, is pretty critical to this, how Two Tone became like a movement, because of the kind of control Jerry had, that he was able to control the artwork and control the bands that were part of it. That had he not got that deal, I'm not sure if we would be thinking Two Tone in the same way that we do now, as like this movement of bands that were on sort of on the same page.
Yeah, no, exactly right. And he's trying to sign bands in the image almost of the Specials. And the other labels were struggling with what this bizarre idea was, because I'm not altogether sure it had ever happened before. And then, of course, the Beat replicate the idea with Go Feet.
So Madness, let's talk about Madness a little bit. Madness form independently of the Specials in London, because they're not aware of each other initially, but they're also fans of reggae and ska and these other elements. And so they're kind of doing their own fusion of these styles of music. And then the bands meet. And then it's my understanding that one of the main things that Madness got from the Specials was the energy level of that they played at.
Yeah, and also the validity to do reggae ska, because Madness would often dropping that element from their set, and it gave them renewed hope when they saw the Specials doing that. And but yeah, I mean, the bands soon played gigs together in July 1979, going up to places like Liverpool. And they, when I speak to members of Madness, as I do, like Mike Barson and Suggs, they are knocked out by the energy level of the Specials and the attitude on stage. And there's this, I mean, one of the absolute incredible elements of Two Tone is all the bands have two singers. I mean, that's just such a bizarre coincidence. The Body Snatchers are the only band that doesn't on Two Tone in this period. In the Beat, you get Rankin Roger, Dave Wakeling, you get Chaz and Suggs in Madness, Neville and Terry in the Specials, and Neil and Pauline in the Selector. That's entirely coincidental. But, that's like John and Paul of the Beatles. But it's not as if that's the normal thing to do in rock and roll history, is it? I mean, it's quite extraordinary. And on top of that, like you said earlier, they're all kind of dressing in the similar ways as one another. They've all fallen in love with Jamaican ska, and the coincidences are huge, and yet it looks like it must be planned in some way, or and yet it just all fortuitously falls into place. Incredible story.
Yeah, definitely. The other thing that's interesting, the Specials, like you were saying, Jerry had a vision and he's trying to take people from these different walks of life to have these different elements. But my impression with Madness is that they're very different in the sense that these are all guys that grew up together or come from the same place. So they're actually not from different walks of life, and not, so they actually have probably in a way a more cohesion to them, which might explain why they were able to sort of, continue on as a band much longer than the other Two Tone bands.
Well, Chaz says in the book that Madness was just nicer. Compared to
Yeah.
they were just compared to the Specials, who just argued all the time. I mean, I have to be careful in saying that, actually, because I think one of the great themes that emerged writing Too Much Too Young is contradiction. And the story of Two Tone is all about contradiction. And it's the contradictory elements of men and women together on stage. It's white, non-white musicians. It's not even black and white from Jamaica. It's all the Caribbean islands. And again, class. I mean, Britain is run on the class system then and now. And yet these bands are made up of working class, middle class, upper class. There's contradiction everywhere. The influences are contradictory. And I think the contradictions is absolutely the strength of Two Tone, because life for most people is a contradiction, and you have to negotiate your day to day with the contradictions of your own feelings, your engagement with society. You think this one day, you might think something another day. But these were all bands that were trying to bring these disparate elements together to see if they could even survive. And the one person that's really eloquent about this in the book is Juliette DeVee, who co-runs the Two Tone office in London with Rick Rogers, and then as a 21-year-old takes on the Selecter and becomes their manager, and is damn good at it too. But she's very articulate and is very, very aware of the challenges facing these individual members internally, their own internal problems of being, particularly in the Selecter, more than half the band have been uprooted as young boys, 7, 8, 9, 10, and suddenly just told, you're going to another country. And they come to Britain, and then they're suddenly thrust into schools where they're getting racist abuse, and having to survive. And then they're suddenly in the band with a woman. Not all of them are very good at dealing with women. And then as Juliet says, the Selecter see racism in everything. And so these contradictions are what makes the vitality and the aggressive sound of the music and gives it something really exciting. But it will also be what lays down the roots of why these bands fight and fall out with each other. But for some odd reason, Madness, who can argue like the best of them, it seems, and like children row with each other and brothers and sisters row, or you can have a row with your mate down the pub, but then you somehow just shove his arm and and just go, and say, and you're all right again, you're friends. Madness always had that ability, and they drew on one another as kind of itinerant kids who grew up and were born from around the UK, but kind of centred around Kentish Town and Muswell Hill and, these, not Muswell, Muswell Hill and Hampstead and these kind of areas, even though they're known as a Camden band. I'm not sure how many of them actually lived in Camden, but they survive and become the success story of the British singles chart in the 1980s.
I want to talk a little about the tension of, like, particularly on the Two Tone tour. So the Two Tone tour is Madness, Selecter, the Specials, and it happens in I think October of 1979. And Madness. So the Specials are very explicitly political, or they have a purpose. But Madness, I don't really see themselves as being a political band. They see themselves more as a pop band, and I think there's some tension about how they handle some of these components at the shows, like the violence and the National Front Nazi kids showing up. What is your take on all that?
Well, Madness are on that tour for 2 weeks, and then the next 3 weeks it's Dex's Midnight Runners, because the Madness are going to come to the States and record an album as well. So, and I'm not sure how. I think it's politics, social politics, not party politics. I'm not sure how political any of the bands are really, in a way, even though somebody like Jerry Dammers, he phoned me up one day and he said, Daniel, I don't know if you can say I'm a Marxist. I've never read Das Kapital. You had to think about that one. But he's got a socialist mindset, and Two Tone is a socialist cooperative as much as it possibly can be. Most of the songs that are on the first albums of those three bands were written under a socialist Labour government. And then by the time Two Tone really breaks and this tour happens, then there's a Conservative government. So it's a kind of, that's an interesting contradiction, isn't it? That it's always supposed that it's, but that it's thought of as anti-Thatcherite, but that does become a thing. But the lyrics aren't born out of that in many instances. But yeah, Madness's background, a couple of the members, and I talk about this in the book, have got right wing backgrounds, very unsavoury backgrounds, and they're like a lot of the audience and it's the great question: can the music of these Two Tone bands turn these impressionable young people from being racist into something more positive? And members of Madness change their outlook and their belief. And Suggs talks about openly in the book about the influence of Jerry and Two Tone and conversations that made him see the world differently. That is brilliant and incredible. But at the same time, the criticism that was around Madness in this period was that the press were calling them out for not speaking out for members of the audience who were Sieg heiling them or coming to their gigs and openly being racist. And Madness ultimately say, we're called Madness because that's a Prince Buster song. He's black. We play the music of Jamaica and ska. Those musicians are black. Their influences of Motown are black musicians. They felt it was so obvious that they didn't that they didn't have a problem with black people. They didn't need to be making statements to the press. But sadly, it wasn't enough, and the accusations and the audiences they attract, people point out Madness, and they struggle with this for 79, 80 and into 81 until they eventually make a statement. Then they do put out a statement in 81.
I mean, I think it's kind of weird. I mean, I guess there's reason for it, but it's kind of weird that like what they're doing attracts these elements, like people coming to the shows and seeing Heiling and National Front, but because it seems like it's so obviously against it. I'm not sure if it's people coming to because of like the roots of this music and like skinheads and stuff, or is it like to antagonize it, or if it's a little bit of both?
Yeah, I mean it's a strange one, isn't it? But I'd probably say that the majority of musicians I've spoken to would probably say that these weren't audience members with an ideological belief in Nazism or fascism. It's something to belong to. And if you agree with a lot of the musicians of Two Tone, these people, their opinions could be turned. And Chaz particularly talks about this idea that, his analogy is lancing a boil. You can't lance a boil from 50 meters away. You have to have proximity. Proximity is get these people into the gigs and let's change their view by what we're offering on stage, which is, inclusivity. And there's a strong argument for that. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, because he had kind of the way he initially expressed it, I think, came off wrong to a lot of people because he said we don't care if
Yeah,
people
but
are
these are teenagers, they're teenagers trying to talk to journalists who are out to get a story.
sure.
They get caught up in their own words, and Chaz isn't a member of Madness yet. He's on stage with them, but he's not officially. And the other members of the band get annoyed and start berating Chaz in front of the journalist, and the journalist goes ahead and prints it all. And at the same time, that same journalist is a fan of Two Tone, and in other articles says great things about all the bands. So it's sad, really. I mean, but Jerry's very aware and was wary that I in the book would put too much emphasis on the right wing elements at Two Tone gigs, because in his opinion, the majority of gigs are absolute celebrations of the brilliant music that these bands are playing, and the audience dance and are brought into the love of Two Tone, and but and that is, I don't doubt, Jerry, but you do get to a situation where Lee Thompson of Madness makes a statement in the latter part of 1980. If this violence doesn't stop, the only solution is we split up. Terry Hall in 1980 says the only solution is for us to stop playing live. And ultimately, as Jerry says about Ghost Town, bands won't play no more. Too much fighting on the dance floor. That's about the Specials, who are going to split because they don't know how to deal. They're attracting violence. They don't want that.
Yeah, definitely. So again, we're kind of talking about the first three two-tone bands because I think it's really important in sort of understanding the development of two-tone. There's the Specials, Madness, and Selector. Also, they did the two-tone tour as well, and all three of those bands played Top of the Pops in when was that? Was that November of 1979, I believe?
Yeah, mid tour, they're all shown on Top of the Pops. I mean, I have to burst the bubble here and say that the Selector weren't in the studio. It was a previous edition that they used the footage of. But it was the great two-tone night. Two-tone, suddenly three bands on this 30-minute show that upwards of 20 million might be watching on one particular week. Wow. Two-tone has landed, and it's as important as the Specials performing on Saturday Night Live, as the Beatles playing on the Ed Sullivan Show. It's a explosive moment for two-tone. There, all the bands have been on Top of the Pops before, but here they are, three bands out of, I don't know how many bands you get on one episode, perhaps 7. Wow, amazing! It was incredible.
So this is two-tone explosion. I think these things we're talking about in late 1979.
Yeah.
The Specials record, famously produced by Elvis Costello,
Yeah.
who also didn't really get what Roddy brought to the table initially.
I don't agree with that. I mean, if you listen to the Specials live, they sound like that's too much too young. That's them live. Well, that is not what the Specials debut album is. It's an entirely different record, but I think it's a brilliant record.
Oh yeah.
And I love all the way that Brad's snare roller beginning of Message You Really jumps out, or Neville's vocal suddenly on Do the Dog is louder than anything you've ever heard on vinyl. And then, things are all like Rolling Stones records, there are just things are leaping out. And you don't get that today, because if you listen to compressed MP3s, the compression damps it all down. But on a vinyl, there it is jumping out. And I think Costello had great oral ideas, and that he's employing across the record. And Roddy's guitar is there when it needs to be there, and I think it has a great it's really, yeah, it's prominent when it needs to be, but not in the way perhaps that Roddy was used to hearing it at a concert. But that's all right, because that's part of the reason why that album was so successful and continues to be. I think Costello, he wasn't a producer, but he became one, and he had a vision. And I think I applaud Elvis Costello for what he did for the Specials.
Yeah, no, that album sounds great. It's so uniquely produced, and it really captures the band in such a great way. One story I loved about that record was that for the opening of Nightclub, how he grabbed a crate of beer, the bands, their friends, apparently a girl in a skin tight red rubber S&M suit. And they got into a small cubicle, and he turned the light out and hit record.
Well, you know who the backing vocalist is, don't you, on Nightclub?
Is Chrissy Hine, right?
There you
From
are.
the Pretenders. Yeah.
According to Roddy, yeah, he slipped her phone number, and she asked for Terry's, and that's where my book gets a bit tabloid. But
Sure.
but who wouldn't want to give your phone number to Terry Hall?
So the Madness record was recorded a little later, but when they signed with Stiff, I think
only just they took Clive Langer, their producer, Alan. When they went in the studios, same studio, straight after the Specials, they got out the Specials tapes to have a listen to see what they're doing, and isn't that great?
Yeah, another fun detail about this one too is that the One Step Beyond was apparently half as long, but then the engineer or producer let's copy and paste the second half and then put record like bring the horn through a processor the second time to make it sound different. Do I understand it correctly?
Yeah, an even-tired harmonizer. Yeah, that's it. That, I don't know if it's strictly as a half, but you can hear it on the single version, on the vinyl version. Absolutely, they don't they re-record it for One Step Beyond the album, but the single
No,
version
it's the single version.
is definitely that. Great because Madness had never performed it more than a minute longer, you know. But I'd love to hear that, wouldn't
Yeah.
you? Just hear that original version. Yeah, but yeah, great, brilliant. And even though they're on Stiff Records by then, they're still very much part of the Two-Tone firmament, aren't they? And they do continue to be until they come to the States, don't they? And they play with the Go-Go's, and they still go on headlines with Two-Tone bands, and then they end up on the Dance Craze soundtrack.
Yeah, and so then these records come out like actually on the same day, which is pretty amazing too.
Yeah, no, brilliant. I mean, what fantastic! That would have stretched your paper round budget, wouldn't it? Which one? Specials Madness. God, how'd you choose? I love thinking about that two-tone tour, which everybody goes, "Oh, amazing!" But the thing I realised that if you're in the audience, you would only know one song by the selector, possibly two, and you'd only know one or two songs by Madness, maybe only one, and you'd only know a handful by the specials until because so that's a strange idea that they're hearing these new sets by these bands and they're still going absolutely nuts because it's just immediate and infectious. It's brilliant.
Now the Selectors record, as you documented, the production was not something that a lot of the band appreciated.
No, I mean, I spoke to pretty much all of that. And I have a feeling I might be the first person ever to have spoken to Errol Ross, the producer, because I thought, hang on a minute, we can't just have all the members of the Selector going on about how bad it is. What does Errol say about all of this? And so that's really interesting to hear his version of it. But really, I mean, I listened to that record. I don't think it's so bad. I mean, I know that Roger Lomas did such an amazing job on my radio and Too Much Pressure. But the Too Much Pressure on the version on the album, I think sounds good. And generally speaking, I don't think it's so bad, and maybe they were trying to do something that was different from what the live thing is. But, I know that Pauline, she loves to Celebrate the Bullet and thinks it's way better, and maybe production wise it is, but I would say that the songs on Too Much Pressure are better as songs, and yeah, I don't know really. I mean, then in saying that, their songs across that whole album probably aren't as strong as the songs of the specials, in my opinion. So. So but I like the Selector because of that album Too Much Pressure, but what I wanted to do in the book was represent what the band went through and what it was like for them in the studio. And I thought that was really fascinating to hear what Commie thinks or what Gaps thought about being in the studio and what they thought of Errol and so I bring it all together and then as a reader, you can hear the stories and go back to the record and hear it in a different way and have, either cling to your view or maybe your view will be changed by the opinion in the book.
In Defense of Ska will return in a moment.
Hey, welcome to Kyle Meredith with Consequence. This is where we check out some of the cool new things happening in the Consequence Podcast Network. I'm Kyle Meredith. Today, I get to talk with Adam Unz to discuss the latest season of The Opus.
Hi.
Well, first off, Adam, congratulations on the new season.
Thanks, Kyle.
So, which album is in the spotlight this season?
As always, it's presented by the Consequence Podcast Network and Sony Legacy Recordings. It's a music history series, and it's coming back to celebrate the 30th anniversary of Alice in Chains' sophomore album, Dirt.
What a classic album. I completely remember hearing it, those first few listens back when it came out, 92. I probably picked it up in 93 and 94. It was just dark and heavy and so melodically beautiful at the same time.
I know. Dirt was truly a genre-bending collection that defined an era. So we're going to help our listeners to explore the context of what was happening back then and also hear how it still inspires artists and fans today.
Sounds great. And you can listen to it at consequence.net or, of course, wherever you get podcasts. It's great talking with you, Adam. Thanks for stopping by.
Thanks, Kyle.
Selector to me have like a very unique sound in that I feel like they took the Jamaican elements of ska and reggae and they took the punk elements authentically and they melded them so well, and almost the most of all the bands, almost the most equally, of taking these influences and making something that was all of those things at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure how much punk there is in the
But it
Selector.
was definitely the energy of it, the just
Yeah, because there's nobody. I'm not sure anybody in the Selector liked punk.
no.
Thinking about it, no, actually, I don't think they do. I don't think Neil was into punk very much, and he's writing the songs. I've did Pauline liked X-Ray Specs, definitely. She was really into to Doobie Doo. What's her name? Polystyrene. Uh, maybe more than but Pauline. But her voice isn't punk, and she hasn't got that much of an influence on a lot of the music on that record. Then they're all the other lot. I don't know. So yeah, I mean they're all uniquely different, aren't they? And all the bands are in the same way as the Beat have got a very different take on these influences. I mean, you start getting into what David Steele uh, and oh, mine's gone blank. What's the guitarist called in the Beat? Andy Cox. I mean, those Andy and David, what they bring to the Beat, I think is sensational, really. And you really hear it. You know, when you think of Johnny Come Home, the first Fun Young Cannibals breakthrough record, that would have been a Beat song just purely on the backing. It's a very Beat idea, and of course, David Steele in the Beat had written a huge part of those songs. So he came with Mirror in the Bathroom and Twist and Crawl. And it's then Dave Wakelin that obviously writes melodies and lyrics, and he's brilliant at it too. But yeah, I mean, all the bands have got unique influences and unique sounds. Otherwise, ultimately, that's why any band in music gets signed, because they've got something individual that no other band's got. Or you hope so, anyway.
So the bands start coming to the US. It seems to me like, with especially the case of the Selector and the Specials, that they just really don't have a great experience in the US, and it kind of deflates them a bit.
I've got quite a few bootlegs of the special, particularly the Specials playing in the States on that first tour. You know, and like when they play Long Island and Debbie Harry introduces them. I mean, that bootleg of that gig is absolutely brilliant, and the audience are going nuts. And the sing along at the end for "You're Wondering Now," which goes on feels like 10 minutes, just the audience on their own, and the band are sounding amazing on that tour, absolutely. But I think it's because they're giving their all, and they can save it up for the performance. And but there is, but they're struggling because the amount of shows they're doing, the proximity of the dates, the enormous size of the States compared to the UK to travel. These elements really test the band, and then you're 7 people plus your entourage, cramped up in tour buses all day long. And then we go back to the contradictions, the class differences, what people want. Do they want those that embrace drugs, those that don't, those that have got middle class backgrounds, have got a certain way of living or want to reject it, those who want to embrace money, others don't. And those contradictions will begin to come out. So they get damaged, the Specials, particularly by their experience of the States. But then Madness come and they find it tough, but they come back and they're all right, and the Selector go and do it. And again, they argue, or they argue, they could argue over a packet of crisps. That's the message that comes across with the Selector. But the Beat survive it and Madness survive it. So whatever you say is the reason for it, the contradiction is the bands that don't fall out because of it. That's a fascinating area, I think.
I get the impression that Jerry in particular didn't really care for the US and his US experience.
Well, he may not care for the experience because what it does to him personally, but I wouldn't say that he feels like that about the US. I don't know if that's true. I mean, even when the Specials say when Neville, Terry, and Linville say they're leaving the Specials around the summer of '81, they come back to the States, don't they, and honour the tour that they've cancelled from January '81, and so the Specials always want to be back there playing to US audiences, even at the lowest ebb that they can be as a band. There they are coming back out to the States. So again, is that contradiction? I don't know. Or is it just, a passion for wanting to bring their music to a US audience?
So there's so much more we could talk about with Two Tone, but I want to kind of leave on this with this question: how Two Tone has impacted British culture, because how it impacted culture outside of England, I think, is that largely that it planted this seed that we call ska. And like you said, it's not actually ska that was Jamaicans played in the 60s, but it is like it was redefined in a way globally, and it planted a seed all over the world, and all these new branches grew in multiple countries. And I think that foundation was two tone for many of them. But I don't know that that's exactly the legacy that it had in British culture. I think it was a little different. So I'm curious on your take of that.
Yeah, well, I mean, at that point in British cultural history, late 70s, early 80s, the rapid turnover of tribal movements is incredible. You're going from punk, new wave, two tone, Adam the Ants, Bow Wow Wow, kind of Burundi drum rhythms, new romantics, synth pop duos. I mean, it's going quick, 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 and sometimes they're running concurrently. So the fact that two tone lasts from the summer of '79 through to summer of '81, that's a hell of a long period to have sustained massive hit records. And although the fashion changes from the Rudy look and evolves, at least they do survive. And then Two Tone itself continues as a label all the way through to '86, and then thereafter with, the legacy immediately is what Jerry does, having written Nelson Mandela for the Special,
Yeah.
AKA, and that ultimately with Nelson Mandela himself at Wembley Stadium on stage and a global audience of 600 million. I mean, that is unbelievable. That's where a two tone record brings a man and everybody singing the song Free Nelson Mandela. But all the cults and the records have always, I would say, lasted because you always hear them on British radio. As I said before, Madness are one of the biggest singles bands of the 80s. Bad Manners have a brilliant run of records in the 80s, and they're on Dance Craze and associated with Two Tone. Likewise, associated with Two Tone, a UB40, one of the most successful reggae bands, mixed race, mixed heritage reggae bands in the world, born out of that. And that their success is phenomenal. And I was a massive UB40 fan. Maybe up to Jeffrey Morgan, where it goes really wrong, in my opinion. But and then there's the revival years, isn't there? You talk about in the States with what people like No Doubt were doing, and the third wave of ska. But in the same way as Two Tone was, as you rightly said, was totally different from Jamaican '60s ska. So Two was early mid '90s American ska of Two Tone. But then the big difference is, I guess, is the when the bands reform and they start playing to massive houses again in Britain. So the Fun Boy specials play to thousands here, and then end up having a #1 album, don't they? And with Encore, the special, the Selector and the Beat, even though it's Rankin Rogers Beat, are playing to places like the Roundhouse. They're not having massive hit records, but they're playing to thousands again. And the Rhoda is still out there doing stuff, and it's regenerating. And the story has never got old, really, or people have never got bored of it. In magazines, radio shows, television documentaries, film documentaries. I mean, Stephen Knight, the director, has got a British drama about Two Tone, the man who created Peaky Blinders, coming out in January 2024. And I'm sure that's going to make Rude Boys and Two Tone massive again. Pauline Black's about to have a documentary on Sky Arts, which is in the filming process at the moment. And now, you know, I humbly put forward my book, and if the first day or so is to go to base anything on, then British sales look like they might be reflecting a passion for wanting to read about the movement in a chunky sized version for the first time ever.
Yeah, I know. It is like, I want to say that it is surprising to me that there hasn't yet been a book like yours about Two Tone, considering how much a part of British culture it was and continues to be.
I thank all the authors around the world for allowing me time to develop my skills and the years it needed to persuade Jerry Dammers to let me do it. So, yeah, I mean, it's astonishing, isn't it? George Marshall's book was brilliant in the early 90s, but it was very thin.
Yeah.
And there's been books on the specials, and members of the bands have written books, and I've slipped in there. So I'm really pleased because, you know, I would love, you know, I've got such a beautiful compliment on that. If you look at John Savage, who wrote the definitive book on punk, England's Dreaming, he wrote a comment about that he really enjoyed the book, and he said a perfect example of where an author and a subject have gloriously come together, or something like that. And it's like, oh wow, I respect John Savage's opinion, and I thought that was a lovely thing to have written.
Yeah, and I think that prior to your book, the closest, in my opinion, to really kind of having a good kind of say this is what Two Tone was and what was about, was the section of your previous book, The Walls Come Tumbling Down, which wasn't about Two Tone. It was about Two Tone's place in this sort of politics of music.
Yeah, exactly. And I've taken some stuff from that book to put into this book because it needs to be part of it. If I hadn't written that book, I would have used it as the source material anyway. But just as a funny thing, I remember Jerry phoned me up when Walls Come Tumbling Down came out, and he said, you know, I spoke to Rick, the manager of the special. He said, Rick thinks it's the best book ever written about Two Tone. I was going, really? Wow, that's brilliant. And Jerry said, but I don't. Which is just so brilliant of Jerry. But, you know, I think Jerry liked it enough that when I did my launch for Walls Come Tumbling Down, he turned up with a box of singles and said, can I DJ? Like, yeah, of course you can. I was just I can't believe that I had a party that I'd organised and Jerry came and DJ'd, and I was talking to so many people that I just wanted to sit and listen to Jerry DJ. I can't believe I didn't. But yeah, but that's very kind of you to say thank you. But and I think it's brilliant. People like Heather Augustine are writing books about Two Tone or Two Tone women, and trying to bring forward and make it relevant to today. And keeping it alive, and I'm really excited that an American publisher in Brooklyn is going to publish a US version of the book. Yeah, doesn't Two Tone deserve a doorstop? And I'm lucky, I'm lucky the person that's put it all together.
Thank you for listening to In Defense of Ska. To support the show, sign up for our Patreon. Intro and outro music by Slow Gherkin from the EP Lives. Additional music by Dan P. and the Bricks. Please rate and review the podcast and tell a friend. Follow at In Defense of Ska on social media. The book In Defense of Ska by Aaron Carnes is available from Clash Books. Order it online. Chris Reeves of SPI is our editor. This is your co-host, Adam Davis of Omnigon, leaving you by saying ska now more than ever. Oh, shit.
What?
I didn't even know that we were done. And here we are. We're at the end of the episode. Thanks for listening to the whole thing.
Did you learn a lot this time, Adam Davis?
I hope you did. Did I learn a lot? Hell yeah, I did.
Yeah, you.
Me. I thought you were talking about our listeners. I always learn a lot.
Yeah.
I'm always happy to learn something new. And you know what? If you want to learn more, there is more to learn over on our Patreon.
Oh, yes.
Including this episode, that we have a whole back catalog of behind the curtain content, access to our Discord, where you can talk to other people who care about ska as much as you and us. And there's other perks on there as well. So sign yourself up. Do yourself a solid. New year, new me. Do it for you.
You want to learn more about ska, and you will learn more about ska by signing up to the In Defense of Ska Patreon.
Aaron, who do we have on the show next week?
Well, you always love drummer guests, right?
Yes, always.
So we have the drummer for Jawbreaker, Adam Faller.
Nice. East Bay. Punk rock.